In the dim light of dawn, when the mist still clung to the low stone cottages and the household hearth burned low, the villagers of Ravensford gathered at the communal oven to stoke the fire. The pot, that endless stew, was more companion than mere meal. Its depths held the memories of every season's spoil, the laughter and tears of countless suppers, and the stubborn refusal of hunger to go unchallenged. The great famine of 23 had stripped the fields bare, and grain stocks dwindled to dust, murmuring prayers for the souls of those the world had forgotten. Medieval peasants wove their tapestry of survival each meal, a testament to human resilience and the whispered hope that tomorrow, as sowing would yield a richer harvest. And though the gruel filled the body, it left the spirit cold. Yet cold or no, it sustained them until the rains came to swell the streams and soften the earth for sowing once more. Then, at the very edge of despair, the peasants turned to gruel. They whispered, as though invoking a specter, plucked and hung in braided clusters above the oven door. These bulbs dried to a brittle snap ready to flavor soups, breads, and occasional scraps of meat. Their sharp tang cut through the monotony of grains and greens, and on market days, a single onion might fetch a penny, its value gleaned not only in cooking but in coin. By late summer, the outer leaves were gently peeled off and thrown into the cauldron, thickening the pottage with their verdant sweetness. A handful of rose hips, boiled with honey, became a potent remedy against coughs and winter chills. Elixir whispered to ward off the grip. From sturdy vines climbed plump pods of green and speckled legumes, bursting with protein beneath their seams, and a handful of foraged greens could tip the scales between life and death. And as the first frost painted delicate lace on the cottage window panes, the peasants sat down once again to their cherished pot of pottage, now enriched with the season's last gifts, and gave thanks for the green bounty that carried them through another year. At dawn's first light, women and children crept into the forest's edge, collecting nettles with gloves of thick cloth, those stinging greens that, once boiled, shed both their hairs and their bitterness, revealing a verdant promise of vitamins. Wild garlic and ramps perfumed the undergrowth, their pungent bulbs tossed into the pottage for a fleeting taste of spring. It breathed with the land's rhythms, the cool sweetness of spring greens, the vibrant pulse of summer beans, the earthy comfort of root vegetables, and the sharp kiss of wild berries. Each ingredient told a story of toil and triumph, of soil turned by calloused hands and hope baked into every loaf. In the damp shadows of ancient oaks, mushrooms appeared like hidden treasures, chanterelles with their golden caps and slippery morels hiding beneath fallen leaves. Each careful gathering relied on memory and caution, for one false step could bring ruin. Peas were split and soaked overnight to remove their bitterness, then boiled into a dense mashed mess of peas. The children called it rich enough to carry them through the next day's toil. In drier seasons, beans were shelled, dried, and stored in clay pots, their hard shells cracking under eager teeth to unleash a creamy, sustaining meal. The remaining head, wrapped in damp straw, would transform into sauerkraut, a pungent, sour delicacy born from layers of salted cabbage, fermented in hidden cellar jars. When the northern winds whispered of frost, jars of bright, tangy sauerkraut were cracked open, and their nourishing juices rekindled the strength of even the most exhausted laborer. A watery concoction of the very last grains in endless water, stirred until it barely resembled food. This thin porridge was served in chipped wooden bowls. Their gaze fell first upon the hardy turnip, its pale bulb nestled just beneath the soil's surface. With a practiced twist, each root emerged, coated in rich earth, its smooth flesh promising sustenance for the long winter to come. Back in the cottage yard, a mother buried freshly harvested turnips in a straw-lined pit, knowing that this simple vegetable would feed her family for months. Boiled into a fragrant stew, sliced into pottage, or roasted beside the hearth until its edges charred to sweet perfection. Even the village dog would turn away from its stench, save when driven by such desperate hunger that no scrap of dignity remained. Children dipped hunks of dense rye bread into the rich broth, watching the blackened loaves soften and split beneath their eager teeth. This bread, baked only once a week in the Lord's mill, was a marvel of necessity. Coarse-grained, dark as the forest undergrowth, bound together with bits of ground beans, chestnuts, or even bark when the wheat was scarce. Their bellies rumbled with the promise of sustenance. For today, the great pot of pottage would be stirred once more. Imagine that cauldron, its iron sides blackened by years of smoke, simmering over the same embers for into it tumbled handfuls of cracked barley and oats, their rough kernels softened by hours of bubbling. With each scoop of graying broths, turnips and leeks harvested only yesterday were cast in, followed by the occasional scrap of salt pork obtained after a successful hunt. A few sprigs of wild parsley and rosemary, picked from hedgerows before dawn, lent a feeble perfume. But it was the grease rising to the surface, the precious fat from a pig's flank, that carried the promise of life itself. Each morning, families ladled this hearty stew into wooden bowls and passed them around the table. Middle of the week, as the loaf hardened under the thatch of each cottage, mothers would crush its crusty edges into the pottage, pot thickening the broth into a porridge so heavy with starch that a single spoonful could silence the most furious pang of hunger. On market days, if fortune smiled, a village family might steer a small ale from the brewer's cart to pour over the bread, softening it into a mush that children called God's porridge, for it seemed a miracle that such plain fare could give strength. Yet there were days when neither pottage, nor bread, nor ale could be counted upon. On those bleak days, hollow-eyed women trudged to the monastery gates, where the kindly ladled their monks gruel slightly enriched with dill or a drop of wine into waiting hands. Thus, between the ever-simmering pottage, the weekly loaf of dark bread, and the thin lifeline of gruel, as the sun climbed higher in the summer sky, the peasants ventured into their humble plots in the nearby woodlands, tools in hand and hope in their hearts. Not far from the turnip patch stood the venerable cabbage's massive heads, whose crisp leaves unfurled like emerald shields. In the cramped garden beds, onions raised their slender necks skyward, their papery skins gleaming in the midday light. When midsummer's sun scorched the fields, peas and dry beans offered a different bounty. Yet the greatest gift of all came from the wild places beyond the tilled soil. Come autumn, the family ventured once more into the brambles for blackberries and into hedgerows for rosehips, their tart fruits prized for jams and medicinal syrup. Throughout these seasons, through turnips and cabbages, peas and beans, nettles and mushrooms, the peasant table was never static. It was a world of scarcity, yes, but also one of remarkable invention, where discarded stock became broth's backbone. When winter's first, frost glazed the fields and shutters closed tight against the wind, the peasants of Ravensford turned to provisions stored from gentler months, none more vital than the barrels of salted herring hauled in from the northern coast. Picture weather-beaten fishermen packing pale silver fish into layers, of course salt, their breath steaming in the dawn air as they heaved casks aboard creaking carts. Inland, these barrels arrived at the manor's stables and were traded to barrels for a modest henby for being wrestled into every peasant home. No fire was required. A single fillet, flaked atop a thick slice of stale bread, offered a briny punch that chased hunger from the belly like a sharp winter wind. Any remnant flour bee, barley, chestnut, or even sifted acorn meal was mixed with water into a stiff paste, shaped by calloused fingers, and pressed into the glowing coals until a charred crust formed. Each humble ration bore witness to their relentless resourcefulness and the unspoken hope that, beyond the cold, spring would awaken the land again. The peasant's eyes turned to the forest edge once more this time, not for nettles or mushrooms, but for every last morsel the wild could yield. At dawn, stooped figures crept between ancient oaks and holly thickets, baskets in hand, searching for the treasures of desperation, and rinsing cracked shells bathed in running water until their bitterness washed away, then dried in the sun. Plucked with care to avoid the sharp barbs, their tart flesh was boiled into thick syrups, preserving a flush of vitamin C to stave off scurvy's creeping weakness. Some healers whispered that a draught of rosehip cordial could heal more than coughs. It could mend a soul burdened by winter-esque gloom. The resulting acorn meal stretched precious flour stalks, though each mouthful carried a faint trace of the oak forest's austere taste, a reminder of that season. Each truffle, once unearthed, was sliced thin and added to pottage, its musk transforming a humble stew into a near-legendary delicacy that villagers spoke of in hushed awe. Then at the hearth's edge, mothers and fathers turned to the age-old art of improvisation. Their final reserves, forests, nuts, hedgerow fruits, improvised cakes, kept them alive just long enough. And when at last the plow's blade rang against dark soil, they dropped their baskets of scraps and ran toward the field's hearts, pounding with relief and the unshakable knowledge that lifelike pottage over coals must always be stirred anew. In battered wooden bowls, they crumbled the remnants of stale bread and dried chestnut scraps, adding leavings of sauerkraut, brine, and bitter dandelion greens plucked from the yard, a few wild garlic stems, the slimy remains of boiled nettles, and the final spoonful of gruel. Into this pot they whispered their fears and hopes, prayers for rain to coax the fields, back to life for grain to swell in the earth, and for the bitter taste of famine to be replaced once more by spring's green abundance. A pinch of salt, a drop of last year's mead, and a handful of pottage broth united the motley scraps into a coarse loaf, flattened and baked among coals until it bore a smoky crust. Gritty and smoky, these cakes were torn apart and dipped into warmed ale, each bite a gritty comfort that spoke of survival's ingenuity. Roasted over the hearth's embers, these nuts released a sweet warmth, their flesh mashed into a coarse flour when grain ran low, or boiled into a paste rich enough to resemble porridge. These ash cakes, bound only by water and desperation, crackled as they cooked, releasing a scent of char and earth that seemed almost sacred in its promise of survival. In some villages, children fanned the embers with long blades of grass, coaxing the nuts to pop like miniature fireworks, and their laughter echoed across the woodland gloom. Alongside them, the last jars of winter's preserves, berry jam, quince paste, beetroot, relish offered, fleeting sweetness, their bright hues a promise that beneath the frost-hardened earth, life stirred once more. When tossed into the pottage pot, the salt-cured flesh dissolved into ribbon strands, infusing the stew with a depth of flavor that seemed almost luxurious after months of turnips and cabbage. Besides fish, the cold months relied on the alchemy of fermentation to stretch every crumb of abundance. In the low-ceilinged kitchens, women tended bubbling vats of ale, small beer. They called it its ruddy foam rising like quicksilver in lindenwood buckets. Morning, noon, and night, each member of the household received a wooden the pale, tart brew, washing down grisly remnants of stew and keeping the dark waters of winter wells at bay. In some cottages, secret batches of cider lay buried beneath the floorboards. Barrels of apple juice crushed and pressed in autumn's flush, now turned into a sharp, sparkling draught with a bite of 70 winters in its temps. On festival nights, feast day of St. Bridget or the midwinter Yule, stronger cider was poured into pewter cups, its nose lifting, aroma mingling with the crackle of Yule logs and the braced laughter of villagers. Dared to hope for spring's return. Yet even fermented grain and fruit could not chase every chill from bone and spirit. For that, the people turned to the spoils of their own hives and had, in candlelit corners, earthenware jars of honey, glowed like imprisoned sunbeams, liquid gold harvested amid summer's wild each drop a memory of lavender and clover. A modest spoonful, stirred into gruel or spread upon crusty bread, coaxed warmth against winter's gloom. And when coughs crept into the household, a syrup of crushed rose hips, honey, and sprigs of thyme steeped, like a healing charm, was administered with whispered blessings. Finally, on the darkest nights, when neither fish, nor brew, nor honey sufficed, the true spirit of peasant ingenuity emerged. The ash cake reborn from the embers. Thus, through salted fish and fermented brews, honeyed remedies, and ember-baked cakes, the peasants of Ravensford braved winter's cruelty. By early spring, when the snow melted into muddy ruts and the fields lay barren under gray skies, they gathered chestnuts, their glossy shells hiding starchy kernels that crackled beneath hammer blows. Acorns, though bitter with tannins, were rescued by a ritual of soaking, where chestnuts and acorns failed. The hardy wild rose hips hung in crimson clusters along thorny hedges. When the forest floor lay carpeted in last autumn's leaves, foragers hunted for fallen nuts and the rare winter truffle, its foxy scent guiding trembling hands beneath cold earth. Yet even these foraged spoils were sometimes gone, stripped away by ravenous hunger or early when coals grew cold, they piled them back into the hearth, nestling between them thin cakes of any ground meal, barley dust, pea flour, even the odd pinch of powdered bark scraped from birch trees. Even the youngest child learned to stir the what we have pot, an endless stew fed by fragments and scraps last night's cabbage leaves. Thus, at the brink of the next sowing season, the peasants of Ravensford stood poised between ruin and renewal.